I should probably also apologize that if there's any loud bashes or crashes, my wife runs a home daycare, which is probably going to happen right above my head in the middle of my talk. So.
Okay. Seems like we're off to a bit of a slow start. I'll give it a few more minutes as we're expecting quite a few more people.
I have been to conferences where we're in a parallel session and we got to our session. It was literally just us, all the different speakers. Everyone else went to a different session. So been there before.
Well, and I know I've sometimes signed up for these online webinars, and then when the time comes, you don't quite feel up to it, or something else gets in the way. Good intentions, you know. Okay, we'll just give it one more minute and then we'll get going. Okay, well, hello everyone. My name's Fiona Lewis and I'm the patient support liaison for AAMAC, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this webinar today. As you may know, AAMAC is a leading funder of research into bone marrow failure diseases in Canada, and I invite you to visit our website to find out more about our services across the country. So your line will be muted during today's presentation, but we're going to have some time for questions at the end. And if you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A feature there, and you can type questions into that as we go along, and we'll address them at the end. And I'll also unmute the lines at the end so you can just ask your question. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our website, usually within about a week. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Stuart Nicholls and Alicia Hilderley to present today's webinar regarding patient-oriented research and patient engagement in clinical trials. Dr. Stuart Nicholls is the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Program Facilitator in the Office for Patient Engagement in Research Activities at the Ottawa Methods Centre. In his capacity as Program Facilitator, Dr. Nicholls consults with researchers to provide methodological guidance regarding all aspects of patient-oriented research. In addition, he provides training and education on patient engagement in research and actively contributes to research in this field. Dr. Nicholls obtained his PhD in social statistics at Lancaster University in the UK. He has over 15 years of health research experience, publishing over 80 peer-reviewed articles on topics including public attitudes to population screening, stakeholder perspectives on the ethical challenges in pragmatic clinical trials, and the development of core outcome sets. Alicia Hilderley is a patient advisor, research participant, and researcher. Her passion for patient-oriented research was amplified following a cancer diagnosis during her postdoctoral research fellowship. Alicia is actively involved as a patient advisor and research partner at the Ottawa Hospital and continues to engage patients in her postdoctoral research projects at the University of Calgary. So welcome to you both, and thank you for being here. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Nicholls to begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to come and present today. I will just share my screen now. Hopefully the full slides are available now and those are visible. So I'll skip the about us, given that you've just had the introduction.
We're not seeing the slides yet.
Oh. Okay. Oh, now are you seeing them?
Yeah.
Okay. And they're now full screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. There we go. First technical obstacle overcome. Yeah, so I'll skip through the introductions about us, but we were asked to provide some learning objectives. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a good sense of what patient-oriented research is and patient engagement is, as well as some of the foundational principles behind patient-oriented research and patient engagement as they apply in Canada, at least. And then finally, we hope that you'll have some insights into how this can be applied to clinical trials with respect to what's been described as the degree of pragmatism or patient-centredness. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by those terms later on. So just to get us started, I'll just talk a little bit about patient-oriented research and how we've got here. So patient engagement and patient-oriented research are here. I think they're here to stay. And we've got a number of entities now, whether it's institutions or programs, that are being built to support patient-oriented research or patient engagement. You might also hear terms like patient and public involvement in the context of other jurisdictions. So we have on the left, as you can see, SPOR, the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, which is the program here in Canada, primarily which is funded through the Canadian Institute of Health Research, which is one of the main national funders of health research generally. There is the National Institutes of Health Research Involved program, which is the UK-based infrastructure that supports patient and public involvement, as it's known there. There's also the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PRagmatic, which is a US-based institution, as well as sort of more localized entities such as the Public and Patient Engagement Collaborative, which is the Master University. We're also seeing it in the patient engagement and patient-oriented research in the medical literature now, and it's been embedded in a number of different ways. A couple of examples here: the British Medical Journal, which is a major medical journal publishing clinical research, not only has had several pieces supporting patient engagement, they actually have required now research articles to have a statement about how they have involved, or if they have involved, patients or the members of the public in the research. And they've led the way in bringing through patient peer reviewers. So when an article is submitted for consideration for the publication, it's reviewed by experts in the field, and they're now leading the way with patient partners who actually review articles and comment often on things like, this is an important piece of research, as well as sort of implications from a patient perspective. The Canadian Medical Association Journal, or CMAJ, is the sort of Canadian equivalent, and has published special issues around patient engagement and research. This example here is from 2018, focused on a number of studies funded through the SPOR program in the Ontario SPOR support unit. But the companion publication, CMAJ Open, which is what's called an open access publication, so you don't have to have a subscription to read it. They actually have a complete stream, so an article type, which is just about patient-oriented research or patient engagement, and they publish those articles specifically focusing on that work. So it really has now been embedded in a lot of medical research. So how did we get to this idea or interest in patient-oriented research? Well, in Canada, it kind of started around 2011 when CIHR, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, looked at its own funding programs and sort of raised two concerns. One is whether the investments it was making in health research really reflected the priorities of Canadian patients and the Canadian public. But then on the back end, they noted there was limited accountability for which research it had funded in terms of its relevance or importance and translation. So this led to some ongoing work, and in 2014, they published what is known as the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research and its Patient Engagement Framework. And this report defines patient-oriented research and patient engagement, as well as setting out a number of guiding principles to support this framework. And I'm going to go through those now. So within that framework, it defines patient-oriented research. And apologies for any noise. I was saying before, my wife runs a home daycare, so there's children running around above my head. But patient-oriented research is a continuum of research that engages patients as partners, and particularly it focuses on identified priorities. So it's about addressing that first challenge that was noted by CIHR, making sure that the research we do is important and addresses the needs of patients. But it's also about research that improves patient outcomes or improves the healthcare system and healthcare system practices. So again, very much about applied research, really making sure that the research we do has an impact on the way we deliver care and on patient experiences. And then finally, as I sort of alluded to, it's about engaging patients as partners. So really, this is where we get the idea of patient engagement. So what does that actually mean? What do we mean by patient engagement? Well, within the framework, it's defined as bringing patients, researchers, and healthcare providers together so that patients are no longer just subjects of research. They're not just participants who have things done to them through research, but they're part of the process in terms of designing and implementing that research and then sharing that and disseminating it at the end of the project. So it's changing that role from subjects to the partners designing and leading research. Of course, this raises the question of what do we mean by patient, and within the framework, strategy for patient-centered research takes a very liberal definition, such that patient is an overarching term that really is about lived experience. So it could be patients, it could be family members, caregivers, friends, etc. But we might also want to engage different stakeholders, so it could be service providers, policymakers, or even members of the public. And I mentioned there are guiding principles laid out in the framework. These are shown here, but they really sort of are about creating that environment. So the first one is about inclusiveness. So making sure we bring that diversity of perspectives. So that, that's fundamental to patient engagement, bringing a different perspective than those just of the researchers, but also thinking about diversity within those perspectives as well. Increasingly, we're seeing a focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion within this. In terms of support, it's about creating an environment where it's conducive to the sharing of lived experience, of sharing one's perspective, being able to give that, but it's also about the practical application of that. So thinking about accessibility of our spaces, thinking about things that might be barriers to participating in research. And the example, this is sort of financial support or compensation for taking part in supporting research as a patient partner. The third principle is one of mutual respect. And again, this is part of creating that supportive and environment that facilitates patient partnership. So acknowledging that researchers, practitioners, patients have different perspectives, they're equally valuable, but creating that space to share those experiences and expertise. And then finally, their goal is to bring all this together so that we can co-build research, patients, researchers, practitioners, and other stakeholders working together to build research, whether it's identifying problems and gaps in the research, setting priorities for future research, or working together to sort of design a specific research study. So that's sort of fairly abstract principles. And to support that, a number of frameworks have been put forward, and this is one I've taken from the Newfoundland and Labrador SPOR support unit. But a number of frameworks share a lot of these features. And a common aspect is this sort of delineation of different ways and different levels to engage patients as partners. So starting at what might be considered some of the lower levels is this idea of informing. So it's sharing information. It's about one-way sharing of information. So it might be a research team putting out a newsletter saying, here's the research we're doing. So that it creates an awareness of research. The sort of next stage up, if you will, is talking about consultation. So again, it's a bit more involved. It's about soliciting feedback, getting the perspective of patients, family members, etc. But it's still very much about getting that information, and then the researchers or an institution retain control of that information, decide what to do. If we move further towards the right, you'll see involvement, collaboration, and this is where we start to have that dialogue, that two-way communication that's indicated in the images below, where you've got those two-way arrows where there's a dialogue happening, and sharing of experiences and interaction. Again, as we move to the furthest right, we have this partnership or empowerment where the patient partners are part of the team, an equal partner with equal weight and decision-making ability and role. So this is just an idea to show that there's no one way to engage. There's a range of different levels to engage, and this can vary across the research project. So I'm going to hand over to Alicia. I'm going to stop sharing so you can see her, and Alicia, over to you.
Thank you. That's a great introduction, and hopefully sets the stage for me sharing some of my experiences. So I'm a patient at the Ottawa Hospital, and I'm also a patient partner in research, a research participant, and a researcher myself. I'm also a mom and a wife who loves the outdoors. And I think explaining all of these roles highlight how a patient is more than a patient, which can be hard to remember, especially when we're working with a narrow research focus. I have different perspectives of the value and challenges of patient-oriented research based on each of these roles and who I am. So I'm going to share some of my experiences with patient-oriented research, and I'll first focus on my role of patient. So why do patients want to participate in research? I think that's a question we often ask ourselves through the recruitment process. And I can't speak to every patient, but I can explain why I choose to be a research participant. And it starts with a cost-benefit analysis. When the benefit of the research speaks to me, when it is patient-oriented, the cost is worth it, whether it is time or more than that for some studies. And it's often really clear to me, even from a recruitment flyer, whether the study is patient-oriented and whether patients were included in the design of the overall study or even just in that flyer. Reading a flyer, I can tell from the language used and when information is shared, whether or not patients were involved. I just completed a 2-year drug trial, which provided me with the best treatment option for my cancer. And the trial was randomized, so there is the chance that I received the placebo, and I still don't know. But this was worth it for the chance to help other patients by improving clinical offerings for them. So this is just an example of how the benefit doesn't have to be direct to me, but it needs to speak to me. In this study, though, I didn't entirely agree with the chosen primary outcomes. The focus was on quantity of life, so life years, but not on the quality of those years. And to me, that's much more important, is the quality of my life. And I thought about how much more relevant the study could be had there been patient input on those outcomes. Now, thinking about why a patient might want to be a research partner. Well, some of my reasons include that I'm motivated to contribute to bettering the experience of other patients. And that was highlighted in my participation in a trial, but I'm not eligible for every trial, nor can I be involved in all of them as a participant. But as a research partner, I can help create research that will lead to meaningful change in clinical care and patient experiences. And it's also an opportunity to use my illness to create something that's positive. I think that speaks to a lot of patients who have had a lot of troubles with their difficulties with their diagnoses or illness, is that we're looking for something positive to come of it. What I also appreciate about being a research partner is having open conversations and the opportunity to feel heard. So an effective partnership removes that power dynamic between a physician and patient. It creates more of a level playing field with mutual respect, where we can talk openly in a conversation about what matters to each other in this context, so we can learn from each other better. There's a couple of lessons that I've learned as a research partner that I'd like to share. I think they may be valuable. So first of all, it takes more time for me to do anything in the role of patient than it would if I was on the research team. I think this may be obvious, but in all of those roles that I have, anything to do with me being a patient partner is volunteer basis. It's not my primary role. It's difficult, or not difficult, it's a challenge for me to learn a new study, to learn a new team, and to be able to find the best way for me to contribute, in my opinion. So as a researcher, you need to know that there needs to be extra time invested or extra time allowed to develop a relationship, to keep the patient informed, to make them feel welcome, to show them respect. There's more effort that needs to be put into it than there would be for a different researcher on your team. It's also intimidating to speak up, and I'm health literate. I'm used to working with different healthcare professionals, but it's still difficult to share my personal experiences. It's different than speaking about work that you've done. Well, that may be close to your heart. It's not what you have gone through yourself. And that sometimes takes me more time to be prepared to share. I've also found that the language that we as researchers use can be difficult to understand. And I know we're aware of that in terms of trying to use lay terms and descriptions, but I think we often don't even know some terms that may be difficult, and patients may not speak up. I had a parent who, after we've been speaking for over half an hour, interrupted me to say that she didn't know what data meant. And that's just a word that I always use. So, it took her courage to interrupt and ask for clarification. But I wish that I had reflected in advance to not put her in that situation. As a patient, I also doubt the value of my singular voice. I feel the weight of the responsibility to represent other patients. And I'm aware of my demographic and who I represent, and that I can't have a voice that represents all patients, but I try to think beyond my own really narrow view as a patient to try to share more so that more patients' voices can be heard in a research project. I think we'll maybe touch on this, but I do find that tokenism is too common. And what I mean by tokenism is adding a patient to your research team and then never really touching base with them or asking for contributions. It's really disheartening and it's really frustrating as a patient when you've committed to something and you are eager to contribute. And it made me, and I think other patients, feel like our voices don't matter. And that tokenism may then reduce the chances of that patient contributing in the future. So it's not just for your project, it's for research overall, that it's important to really value a patient who you've asked to be involved. I'd like to also acknowledge that, I came into being a patient as someone who is passionate about patient-oriented research. In my postdoctoral research, I have always wanted to find ways to engage children and families. I love learning from them, and I love hearing what's most important to them to inform research and design. And so when I became a patient, I already valued the patient contribution. But I didn't quite understand it as well as I do now that I've been a patient and sit in those shoes. And what has been humbling to realize is that oftentimes the priorities that I identified as a researcher didn't align with patient priorities. And I think that's an important reflection, that sometimes we get caught up in what we think is important when it might not be that important in the patient's world. And, circling back to my example of being a research participant in the trial that I was in, it doesn't really matter to me how long I live if it's not a good life. And I think having a patient to share that to a researcher gives you a better perspective of what is important. It makes that patient-oriented piece really meaningful. And I've learned that as a clinician or researcher, we see a series of snapshots of a patient's life. And I really appreciate this now. As a patient, that I tell my clinician is typically medically focused. I'm not sharing the most important things in my life, or maybe the pieces that could be tweaked to improve my quality of life. We really only talk about what can be done in a specific context of their role and my role in that medical setting. And I think as researchers partnering with patients, we have the opportunity to ask questions of patients, especially, the direct question of how can we make your experience better? And that will make our research better. And it doesn't happen overnight. And you're not going to stumble upon a patient who can just tell you these answers right away for how to create meaningful research. It's something that I think you discover together. So it's really committing to that partnership and dedicating time because you care about what you can create together in terms of meaningful research. And that's kind of a jumped around summary of my experiences, but I hope that it had some valuable insights or reflections for you on what it is like to be a patient in the world of research. Thank you. I think I'll pass it back to Stuart to keep going through things.
Thank you. And I'll touch back on some of those points as we continue. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the slides again now. So I talked a little bit about the principles. I talked a little bit about framework or sort of generic framework. I'd like to talk a little bit now about some more specifics and and give some examples perhaps, which again, as I say, we'll touch on some of the issues that Alicia just mentioned. So I hope this isn't patronizing, but I just wanted to go over a sort of a fairly generic research life cycle. And as I say, this isn't applied to any one specific type of research, but offers some insights into some of the key steps, I think. So research often starts with an idea or a previous discovery that stimulates an idea. And then there's a process of turning that research idea and sort of realizing that through a study. So you have to sort of design the study, figure out what materials you need to make that study work. And then there's a process of data collection, and that could be everything from a clinical trial where you've got an outcome you're collecting information on, it could be a survey. There's then a process of pulling that data together, potentially cleaning it up, storing it, and then there's a process of analyzing that data. Importantly, there's a real, and this often gets overlooked, there's a process of interpreting what that data actually means when you've analyzed it. What do those results actually mean? And then commonly what would happen within a sort of academic research environment is that that's written up either as a journal article that would go to those, the British Medical Journal or CMAJ that I mentioned at the start, or it could be a standalone report that would be put out by the institution. And so that's published somewhere. And then we would hope that that leads to change or improves practice, patient outcomes, etc.
Stuart,
yep.
Can I just interrupt for a
Absolutely.
second? One of our participants has raised her hand, so I'll just unmute her and see if she has a question. Christine, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
We can,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay. In that last graph that you showed in the research cycle, at what point does the patient engagement come in? Is it right at the beginning, or is it somewhere else through this framework?
So I would say it could be anywhere, and my next slide will be a way into that and some examples.
Sorry.
No problem. So great point. Oops, my computer has just, can you still see the slides, or have they disappeared?
We can see your
They're down at the bottom.
Yeah, the slides are there we go.
Okay, so yes, so taking that sort of cycle, this was a group that tried to sort of pull together different examples from the literature and apply them to that research cycle. So they split that cycle into 3 steps, and my computer is doing some very strange things, but hopefully you can still see the slides. They split it up into 3 stages, what they call the preparatory phase, an execution phase, and a translation phase. And so that preparatory phase is very much about setting the agenda, that research idea, maybe getting the funding to do your study and so forth.
We've lost your slides.
Oh no.
We're seeing your,
There it is, okay.
Oh, it seems to be that I'm losing one of my screens. I have it popping up on a second screen, so I'll go back. And absolutely, that's where patient engagement can and hopefully should really start. There can be input into what are the research priorities. So there are examples. There's an organization called the James Lind Alliance, and they have what are called priority setting partnerships, and they bring different stakeholders, often with a large number of patients, who sort of work together. They come up with a list of ideas, and then they kind of prioritize them and sort of rank them in terms of order. That can be then used by research to say, this has been identified as a priority, let's work as a team and develop an idea. Often it can be maybe other aspects of that process, so it could be helping to ensure that when the grant goes in, it's clear, is there input on the study design and so forth. Okay, I have lost everything. I'm just going to separate my screens. Just keep it on one screen, it will be clear. I'm just going to re-share my slides because I've taken off my second screen, which seems to be causing the problem. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, can you see them now?
No, they're coming up. Yeah.
So I did, in a potential anticipation of this, I did share my slides, I think, yesterday.
Mhm.
If you have them and want to try sharing them from your end, I don't know. It just seems to be that I'm having some difficulties.
Sure, I can try that. Just a sec. Here. Are you seeing them now? Oh, we've lost your mic.
Yep, I'm back. Sorry. Great. So yeah. So there are, those are just a couple of examples how patient engagement can occur at that stage. But then as we move through that execution phase, so actually doing the study, there might be examples like reviewing the consent form, making sure the consent form is clear. Is the language clear that and written in a way that would allow patients who are going to be participants in the trial, is that going to be clear for them? And again, maybe the advertisement, the flyer, as Alicia mentioned, is that something that's clear? It can also then be things like selecting the outcome measure. Again, Alicia mentioned this in her presentation. Is it something that's important to the patients who would be part of the trial? It can then also be things like interpreting the results. We've analyzed the data. What would that mean from a lived experience perspective? And then finally, in this translational phase, as Shippey and colleagues put it, there is a role potentially in terms of writing the manuscript, coming up with a sort of public-facing summary of that research, helping share that research. So often there will be sort of networks that the patient partners would have access to that the researchers don't traditionally have access to. And increasingly that with things like patient and family advisory committees at hospitals, there's a potential opportunity for patient partners to bring the research to those committees where decisions are made in the hospital and sort of have that voice there. So I would argue that there is an opportunity and a role for patient engagement throughout that research life cycle. And part of it's about educating researchers and research teams to think about that from the outset. But also things like budgets to make sure they have the compensation available, the budget and resources available to facilitate that patient engagement throughout. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, please. So one aspect of this, and a major part of clinical research is clinical trials. And again, Alicia gave an example of her role as a patient participant in a clinical trial. And part of the reason I wanted to just spend a little bit of time focusing on this one methodology, acknowledging that patient-oriented research is broader than clinical trials, is that it is a major source of research with the generation of evidence to try and change practice or develop new interventions or drugs, etc. But it shares many of the same features that were put out by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, in the sense that people have expressed concerns that the way we do clinical trials is not reflective of priorities, it doesn't reflect the real world. And so there's concern about trying to make clinical trials more realistic or more patient-oriented, or as others have called them, more pragmatic. Can go to the next slide, please. And a major driver for this has been this perceived lag between moving from clinical research into clinical practice. So getting, if we find a new drug or a useful intervention or change in practice in clinical research, trying to get that into practice can be a challenge. And one of the challenges that has been proposed is that the trial that was done doesn't reflect how clinical practice works. So when we try and move the intervention of interest into clinical practice, things don't work as they did in the trial. We don't maybe see the benefits we saw. And that's part of that's been leveled at the fact that the trial isn't reflective of how things actually work. So again, that's a stimulator for trying to look at how we design our trials to make sure that they reflect the real world, so that hopefully we can bridge this gap and make sure that when we have research that shows promise, it actually gets used in practice. We go to the next slide, please. However, we're still lagging in terms of patient engagement in clinical trials. This was a review now about 4 years old, where the team looked at the literature and found a very, very small number of trials actually reported that they'd engaged patients as partners. And when they did, it was often lumped at that start. So it was about some initial input, but then there really wasn't that much noted engagement as the trial went on, analyzing the results, helping it dissemination, etc. So I think whilst there's interest, we still have a way to go in terms of at least reporting what was done. It may be that there was engagement happening, but it wasn't clearly reported. Next slide, please. So I mentioned clinical trials and the word pragmatic. This is just a slightly different terminology that's sort of arisen in the trials literature, but it really does map onto this idea of patient-oriented research or patient-oriented clinical trials. So randomized controlled trials are those trials that Alicia talked about, where we would randomly allocate the treatment or the comparison treatment to the patients who are in the trial. And when people have thought about the way that trials are designed, they've characterized those sort of trials that don't really work in terms of the translation or don't sort of map across as sort of, they've called them explanatory trials. So the idea is that these are often set up maybe more like a laboratory experiment where things are controlled, it's tightly managed, but that's not how it works in the real world. So the term pragmatic has been used to sort of try and articulate this idea that we have these decisions and features of a trial design that we can try and take from clinical practice in order to bridge that gap. If we can go to the next slide, please. And while there are many ways we can think about trying to make a trial more patient-oriented or pragmatic, this was the result of some work that was done a few years ago now by teams in the UK and Canada. And through a sort of expert consensus process, they came up with 9 features of trial design that they felt were important and would affect how explanatory or pragmatic the trial will be. So being more pragmatic means it hopefully is more real world or reflects what would happen. So there are things like the eligibility criteria. So that means like what types of patients are going to be in the trial. Are the trial participants similar to the patients you would see in the clinic, or have we selected out certain types of patients so we only have a small subsample of those? The recruitment process, again, are we excluding people who don't speak English, or do we set up barriers in that process that would exclude people who would still get that treatment in clinical practice? Things like the setting and the organization, about how the trial is done. Are there extra resources, extra staff that wouldn't be there in practice? So again, how does that reflect what would happen in the real world? And the way we deliver the intervention, are we having extra staff, as I mentioned, but are there also monitoring that wouldn't be there after the trial's rolled out, the intervention would be rolled out in practice? We wouldn't have someone making sure you've taken your medications and so forth. Similarly with the follow-up, are we following people up every week, or would we say maybe following up on the same maybe 2-month follow-up that you would have in clinical practice? Again, how does that reflect? We talked about the primary outcome, is it relevant to patient? And then the analysis as well. Are we excluding people who didn't follow the protocol, or are we including everyone who was given a drug and maybe didn't follow it in the same way? So those are all features that were sort of suggested as being ways we can think about and look at a trial to see, is this really patient-oriented or pragmatic? Can you go to the next slide, please? So yes, this is just a very quick summary, taking some of those examples where, on the explanatory side, we might say, can the intervention work under an ideal set of circumstances? Whereas a pragmatic or patient-oriented attitude is like, does this work as it would be used in normal practice? Are the people that we're including in the trial the same or similar to those that would be given this intervention in clinical practice, or are they a selected population? Do we enforce or support adherence versus giving it as it would be and follow it up as it would be in practice? And then the same, in terms of the outcome, are we actually asking something about quality of life, or are we measuring some change in a blood sample, something that may have little to no meaning to the patients themselves? So ultimately, what we would hope is that we would be able to design a trial that's more pragmatic or more patient-oriented, so that the impact and relevance to practice is more direct, and hopefully that leads to quicker and better translation of positive research findings into clinical practice. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, patient-oriented research is not a single type of research, it's a continuum of different types of research study designs. But the focus really is about engaging patients as partners, not just as subjects, addressing patient-identified priorities, and trying to do applied research that improves patient outcomes or health systems outcomes. As mentioned, it's about bringing the patient, and again, that liberal definition, patients, families, caregivers, those with lived experience, into the decision-making process and helping to design and conduct research. And to do so in an environment, we create an environment that allows and facilitates the sharing of those experiences, the expertise, so that we can co-build research for the benefit of patients. Next slide, please. Thank you. Hopefully you saw from that research lifecycle and the model that patient engagement can and hopefully should occur across that research process, to have different levels of engagement potentially at different time points. And I share just one example of that PRagmatic framework, where we can think about a clinical trial and how pragmatic or patient-oriented it is through a number of different features, such as who gets to be involved, what the outcome measure is, and so forth. Next slide, please. So I mentioned some of the resources. This is just the website for the Office for Patient Engagement and Research Activities, where I'm based at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. We have some resources, some tools, etc., as well as information about events and so forth. Next slide, please. But there are what are called SPOR support units. So these are units that have been developed and now exist in each of the provinces and territories, where you can reach out, and this is from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research website, but those are all links to the different support unit websites. And so there are resources for local support wherever you are across Canada now. So next slide, please. So I'll just finish by saying thank you very much for the opportunity again, and apologies for the technical issue, but thank you very much for listening.
Great, well, thank you for that. I'll just unmute people here in case anybody has a question. Oh, I think Christine does. Go ahead, Christine.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you very much for that presentation. Although I kept thinking back to the previous speaker who talked about tokenism. And I see a lot of really nice words in your presentation, but I'm not sure that I got a real sense of how patients are truly involved in this. Like, how do you avoid the issues of tokenism, where you bring in patients to say you bring in patients, and that you have a strategy and a plan for patients, but remembering this is just a single person. You've got a whole network of patients out there across Canada through support groups and other venues. How do you avoid issues of tokenism And how do you sort of reach out beyond a single patient to include an entire community where, you know, the results may be quite different? Or is that something that's just too difficult to manage in the context of a trial?
I mean, I can start if you want, Alicia, or do you want to sort of jump in?
Go ahead and I can go after.
Okay, so you're absolutely right. You know, one of the things we often say is that, you know, don't just have one patient partner. We try and advocate for having more than one patient partner, in part because it can be difficult to speak up or have a voice where you're the only person at that table. So that sort of mutual support, having other patient partners on a team, we often advocate for, or we generally advocate for, but acknowledging that you can't represent the whole patient population through direct input from you know, a couple or a handful of patient partners. And there are different structures. So, you know, some teams have 2 or 3 patient partners who would sit and come to every team meeting and have input on all the decisions and weigh in. Other teams have things like a patient advisory group that would be independent of the research team and would be consulted at particular points. There are different sort of methodologies for doing that. So focus group, you know, you could go into a focus group and have a big discussion and really work through some of the issues and then come to decisions within that group. So I accept, yeah, and there's a number of challenges around sort of trying to evaluate the impact of patient engagement on research. That's a, you know, a hot topic of like, what difference does it make? And, you know, we've done qualitative work where often you know, there would be direct impact on the study, but actually a secondary or another impact is that the researcher really starts to think about their research through a patient-oriented lens. It's like, my next study, how am I going to think about my next study? And the other thing is the relationship building. We know we work with teams through the Ottawa Hospital who've been working with the same patient partners for like 2, 3, 4 projects now, because they've built that relationship up. And often the second project is spurred by a comment or an insight that was made for the first project that wasn't necessarily the focus of that project, but was picked up and said, right, we're going to address that in our next project. So there are many challenges in terms of demonstrating that impact and input, but I think there's a number of different ways that can happen. I don't know if that's started to address your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple of things, if you're okay with me adding. You know, I wish there was the literature review you could do of patient experiences, that you had an idea of what kind of everyone is thinking or feeling. But something I've noticed is that when clinicians who are directly involved with the patient group are involved in the research team, they're often able to share a broader perspective of patient perspectives. Right. Which is really beneficial. So don't discount like their role, whether it's formal or just providing that feedback. And then, as Stuart mentioned, thinking about which aspects of your research study would most benefit from a more diverse perspective beyond the 1 or 2 partners who you've established on your team. As a small example, one study that I'm working on, we have 2 patient partners, but we're creating a parent manual. So we've asked for a larger group of parents to join just to review that document. So there are 6 of them. We've tried to have kind of diverse representation in that group where they can all review it. We get, you know, a broader perspective and richer feedback from them. And then finally, to kind of navigate those different levels of relationships, Stuart and his team have created terms of reference for patients. And when they first sent me one, it was so helpful to read through as a patient partner. It outlined my role, what was expected, which pieces I'd be contributing to. And that really helped me. And I think it really helps researchers as well to map out what is expected of that partnership. So whether it's 1 or 2 patients who are kind of part of your core team, and then you have those focus groups or advisors who step in, you can really map out how you will get all those perspectives with the terms of reference idea.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Maybe I'll just ask the one I had while people are thinking. Stuart, you mentioned a group that brings patients together to set priorities. Was that an American group or a North American?
No, so the James Lind Alliance was primarily, it was developed in the UK, but it's a methodology that's now been adopted by different groups around the world. So there are groups in Canada, there's groups all over. And so it's just a way that they try and sort of, again, develop those priorities and come up with, you know, a sort of consensus process to try and figure out where we should prioritize investment, things like that. So it's, you know, that's just one mechanism to do that. There are other ways to do that, but yeah, and they have a website and I can provide those resources as well.
Do they tend to be disease specific or are they broader?
Yeah, it tends to be disease specific. So, you know, and they post all of them publicly. So they have what they call their top 10s or their PSPs, priority setting partnership top 10s, and they post them all on the website for the James Lind Alliance. So you can see the things that are done and maybe identify gaps where there aren't those. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions. Oh yeah, Christine has one. Go ahead.
Yeah, me again, sorry.
That's okay.
This obviously interests me very much, which is why I have so many questions, but how do you identify your patient partners? I mean, are they generally already patients at the hospital, or do you reach out to support groups and ask for volunteers? Like, how does that work?
So I can share a little bit about what we do at the Ottawa Hospital. It varies from institution to institution, I'll say that. But one of the things we decided to do at the Ottawa Hospital was the hospital had already developed a number of patient and family advisory committees. So there's a corporate PFAC, as they're known, but there's also things like a deaf PFAC, a rainbow PFAC, cancer PFAC. So there were already these committees that were established. And then through the program that developed around that, the patient family engagement program, there's now a sort of pool of advisors. I think there's about 200 patient advisors now linked through that program who maybe sit on a committee. Some just want to get involved in specific projects. So what we opted to do is, rather than trying to sort of develop a network of research specific patient partners, we often work with that program to say, is there anyone in your program who might be interested with working with this research team? We then ask the teams to sort of develop a little, whether it's a flyer or an advert or short description of their projects, that then we can put out to those advisors to see if there's an expression of interest from them. And then we have a meeting to have a bit more of a discussion to see if once there's a bit more information, they remain interested, but also whether it feels like a good fit in terms of maybe time commitments that might be needed or what the expectations might be. So that's our process. And again, I can share a short link to some more information about that. But I know other places such as Chio, the Children's Hospital, which is right next door to us in Ottawa, has a slightly different process. So they have almost a standing committee with patients or parents from a range of different experiences. So they're not all one condition, they're not matching one condition, but they allow the researchers to come to that committee and just get some general feedback. And then there's a process of allowing those patient or parents to sort of indicate if they want to work directly with that team. So slightly different mechanism there. But one of the things we're noticing in the literature is a number of places like the Institute of Clinical Evaluative Sciences, which does this sort of big data kind of analysis, they're publishing now their infrastructure and their mechanisms for engaging patients. So yeah, varies a lot, but hopefully it's becoming more visible in terms of how people are doing that. And we can start to share information and see what's working and what's not.
Thank you.
The one thing, I also work at the Alberta Children's Hospital, and there isn't, as an established process there. Something we recently did that was successful was sent out flyers to clinicians to share with parents who they thought might be interested. And that was quite successful in terms of a recruitment strategy for patient partners. And it depends, I think, too, right, on who you're looking to partner with, the strategy that you use. I acknowledge I'm sort of, I think for a lot of studies, kind of low-hanging fruit, because I have research background, I'm a patient, so I'm asked quite a bit to be involved in things. But I don't know if that's always the best fit or if it's just the easiest way. So I think it's important to reflect on that as well.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions out there? Okay, well, we're pretty much out of time anyway, so that was perfect timing. Thank you so much, Stuart and Alicia, for presenting today, and Alicia for sharing your experience. It's really great to hear from someone who's been involved firsthand. And I just want to thank the people who joined to hear the webinar. We do have more coming up through May and June, so please check out our website and register for those. And we are also still holding patient support groups. They're not in person right now, but we're doing them online across the country. And those are also listed on our website, as well as the registration information. So with that, we'll close it off, and wish everybody a great afternoon. And thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.